HCIAS Podcast, Conectando Ibero-América.
A program of the Heidelberg Center for Ibero-American Studies.
Sejam todos bem-vindos.
Bienvenidos a nuestro podcast.
Hello, I am Soledad Álvarez Velasco, Junior Professor of Migration and the Americas at the Heidelberg Center for Ibero-American Studies, HCIAS.
Hello, my name is Héctor. I am a research associate at the Heidelberg Center for Ibero-American Studies, and I coordinate the publications series.
My name is Ulrike Gerhard. I'm an urban geographer at the Heidelberg Center for American Studies and the Geography Department at Heidelberg University.
Welcome you all. We will be your hosts in this series of podcasts, which are part of a joint collaboration between the Heidelberg Center of Ibero-American Studies, the HCIAS, and the Heidelberg Center of American Studies, HCA. Both institutions have joined efforts to organize a series of lectures under the broad theme of migrations across the Americas. This is how we are opening a line of reflection upon the complex history of U.S., Latin American, and Caribbean relations. We are interested in historicizing the geoeconomic and geopolitical impact of these relations in the present and understanding how they have been determined in the migratory dynamics across the continent. We also seek to comprehend how those relations explain growing social inequalities across the continent and how Latin Americans have recreated livelihood strategies, including survival economies and urban and cross-border care infrastructures. Out of this series of lectures, we will produce various podcasts out of conversations with each of our guest lecturers. And this is why we are here today. Ulrike.
Yes, we are honored to launch our series of podcasts with the second episode, Migration and Motherhood as Infrastructures of Care, a dialogue with Professor Solange Muñoz. Dr. Muñoz is Assistant Professor for Cultural Geography at the Department of Geography and Sustainability at the University of Tenesse in Knoxville. Being born and raised in the US, her family background goes back to South America, where she has spent several years doing research and teaching. She then returned to the US as a young scholar, teaching and researching at different universities before settling for a tenure-track position as a professor for geography at the University of Tenesse. From there, she has continued to do research on migration, housing, and infrastructures of care in Latin America, but also extended her research interest to different cities in the US. And this is why we think she's wonderfully equipped to continue our podcast. Looking specifically at migration and motherhood as infrastructures of care shifts the focus on gender issues and employment, which are highly relevant for migration. She has done a lot of research on that, and we are very happy to have her here today, and we would like to start with the first question. Okay, Solange, how do you study migration? What is your specific research approach?
Well, thank you, Ulrike, for that question, and also thank you for the opportunity to be here to talk about my work and to talk about these issues. I'd like to answer the question of how do I study migration, thinking more about why I study it and some of my objectives. For me, I think it's very important. Migrants are attended, especially in the United States. Migration is often looked at as illegal, as a threat, as a problem. And it's not just in the United States. I think it's everywhere in the world. Different countries have different ways of managing it. And yet, at the same time, these are individuals, these are people that are just trying to make it. And so I think that this allows, so one of the things that I want to do is really talk about migration, is to put those stories out there, to tell the stories of people, of individuals, of communities that are often invisibilized, marginalized, and often their stories are told by others who don't really know what they are. And so a lot of my work is ethnographic, it's on the ground. I want to hear the stories, I want to hear people's narratives, I want to hear their experiences. And then I try to the best of my abilities, it's probably very imperfect, but I try to then tell those stories or to provide those stories through research and giving a voice to these people.
And I know that you use the terminology of the people as infrastructures politics approach. Do you want to very briefly explain what you mean by these infrastructures?
So infrastructures in a more traditional way are kind of understood as public works, right? Roads, basic resources that are given to all of to people, to a society. And I'm really thinking about people as infrastructures in terms of the practices that people engage in, oftentimes communities that don't have access to those resources. And so the ways that they kind of resolve access to basic things, to daily life, right? So how do we resolve things that we need in our daily lives when we don't necessarily always have access to them? And so oftentimes it's through practices, it's through people, it's through networks, it's through relationships that come together to be able to get things done, if you will.
Querida Solange, as part of this series of podcasts that we are developing, we like to ask our guests how biography and research are intimately linked. So we would like to know, in what ways do you think your life experience of being born and raised into a mixed migrant family, you were just talking about the experience of being a migrant, your father from Bolivia, your mother from the United Kingdom, how do you think this experience shaped your critical research interests?
So I think in many ways I was not aware of my parents as migrants. I think oftentimes second generation children grow up in their household and they never see their parents as migrants. I remember years ago when I was already an adult and someone said my father had an accent when he spoke English. And I said, no, he doesn't. Because for me, I didn't hear it, but he has an accent. And my mother, who's British, still does have her accent, but again, it was very subtle for me. I think in the bigger picture, so I always tell this story. When I grew up, we lived in a very small house. We didn't have a lot of money, but both of my parents did come from not wealthy families, but well-off families in their countries. And yet we didn't have a lot of money growing up. And my father, when he came to the United States, also didn't have a lot of money growing up. And we lived in an area which was very mixed. So it was in the United States. It was an area that had a large African-American community, and then also lots of immigrants from Arab countries, just also mixed families. And for me, all of these experiences were very important because I think that they allowed me to grow up in a space where everybody really was different. Mm-hmm. And I didn't really question it until I was in my teenage years. For me, this was very normal. And also, it was very interesting being a family of immigrants, but also being a much more stable family in a neighborhood where there were lots of single parents, lots of single families. It allowed me to move through different positions in a society. So it allowed me to kind of move through borders, class borders, racial borders, in ways that, I still think, I feel so privileged to have that experience.
And Solange, do you think this language management in the family belongs also to care work, or to care strategies? Yes, sorry. In many ways, I think. The most typical would be that, children, second generation children, they go home or they go to school and they're speaking one language, and then they come home and they're speaking another language. And it belongs to care, but there's also the code switching, right? So you learn to be somebody in one space, and then you learn to be someone in another space. And when in a positive way, I think that people can then create that identity that it's multifaceted. There's the negative side to that, where people feel very isolated in these different spaces. But I think that as societies become more and more diverse, I think the younger generations really do see these things as, I can mix many things. Going back to the question of care, I think that, you grow up feeling differently and using different words to express yourself emotionally in ways that don't necessarily translate in the different language. So yes, I mean, the other thing about language is everywhere, right? And I think we forget. So we use language to communicate in a very practical way, but language is also who we are. It's also being able to understand the nuances, the complexities of a movement, of, again, the emotional, right? And so it's always there, but we don't always see it.
I have another question, Solange. By reading your work, I was thinking about the idea of a strict separation between the public sphere and the domestic, which was proposed by Hannah Arendt in her great book, The Human Condition, as a base for political participation in the modernity. Do you think that bringing care from the domestic into the public can be used to transform some structures that determine more individualistic migration regimes?
So I've been thinking a lot about this question. I am not as familiar with Hannah Arendt as much as I should be. But for me, so I study housing and I study ideas of home. I teach a class at the University of Tenesse called Landscapes of Home. And it's to really think through this notion of what home is. Not simply for the individual or for the nuclear family, but what is home as what I consider a central space that then connects everything else that we do in the public sphere. And so where you live, it determines the types of relationships you will have. It determines your access to resources, determines perhaps where, we in the United States, they always talk about food deserts, right? And so oftentimes people don't have access to good food because it's just these kind of dollar general stores. And so the home becomes so important, and yet we often don't think about home within this realm of the public sphere. When you add care to it, there's a lot of literature now on what care is. And I think that if we start to think about care as political, then the relationships that start in the home as care, taking care of your children, then they move out into the public sphere. And so you can think about care in terms of how it starts in this kind of nuclear family where we generally see it or we think about it in this nuclear family. And yet care relationships are the everyday relationships that we experience in the street. If I hit someone, or if on my bike, right? If I hit someone, I will stop. I'll make sure that they're okay. But if I see someone who needs something in the street too, in the public sphere, going to them and saying, "Are you all right? Can I help you?" These little acts, I think that this also kind of goes to this bigger idea of what care is in terms of, in the past, we had these big theories, Marxism, capitalism, and we're seeing that, they're not giving us answers that we need now. And so it's the daily connections. What can we learn from the daily connections to allow us to maybe, perhaps, make social change and seek social justice?
Solange, you are making us think a lot. I have a new question that just appeared now that you are talking about care. Why do you research care? Why it is important to take care of care?
In part for some of these reasons, right? I think for some of the reasons I mentioned earlier. I think that we need, if we're going to study women in particular, we have to think about care. Because I think that what women do, not just mothers, I was going to say particularly mothers, but not just mothers. I think that women in most societies, in all societies, are kind of central to care. And it's the family care, but it's also the public care. And it's not always, I don't want to celebrate this. I also see it as a burden. I think that society puts this responsibility on women, but they take it and they run with it. Oftentimes, they sacrifice themselves for it. And so I think to understand women, again, on that day-to-day, that daily level, on what they're doing, why they're doing certain things, you have to think about care, and you have to start to think about care in different ways.
if I just might, I'm allowed to support this, and I find this a very important question, why do you study care? But I really want to emphasize that it's the most urgent topic right now in our societies, right? With the aging society, with the service society, where it's not about industrial production so much anymore, but about social relations and service, consumerism and everything. So therefore the care sector has become a new relevance, and it's it's discussed intensively, very heatedly, by different social groups. And as you say, it's the women especially taking care of this, and therefore it's such an important topic also for women's studies, for feminist studies, but for geography, for in migration context, because it causes a lot of migration. And maybe we can ask this question now, as Latin American women have been pivotal in global care chains, providing domestic care service in destination countries, mainly in the US, in southern cone countries like Argentina, a historical destination in South America. How do unequal geographical developments then, patriarchy and border regime, converge and materialize in the dynamics of these global care chains?
That's a very good question, and also it kind of speaks to what you were saying, Ulrike. This idea that we need to really understand care within these political and global, not just global contexts, but also the way that the economic context, the way that neoliberalism has really changed the way that we relate to one another, the demands that are put on us, the exploitation, the different ways that women are exploited from other groups, for example. And what's so interesting and so troubling, I would say, but also fascinating with migration and women and these global care networks is the ways that countries rely on women to migrate in order to be able to fund and take care of their own societies. And so they rely on women, they basically push them out to go to these other countries because they know that women are going to be reliable, they're going to send remittances, they're going to provide funding for their families that the state in their home countries cannot. And so women are again, they're this kind of, one could think about it as this central space, this central agent of national economies to some extent. I mean, I know it's more complex than that, but at the same time, they're completely exploited. And this is the other thing, that the contradictions that exist are just terrible.
Solange, and now talking about care and migrant care, the role of women, in addition to providing care as service to be paid, also migrant women reconfigure their motherhood through, and this is something that you have worked on, through transnational networks of social and digital care. And there's another part or another dimension of this care that we are curious to know, that if in your research, in your migrant center research, you have identified how women take care of themselves, how these migrant women are taking care of their bodies, their emotions, their memories. So in other words, how do the caretakers, these migrant women, care for themselves, and why it is important for us to learn about that?
So I think it's a relatively new concept that I was thinking about based on research that I recently just finished a manuscript where I'm thinking about this idea of self-care. And I want to be careful because I don't want to present migrant women simply as victims. I also don't want to present migrant women as having full agency. It's a very nuanced, it's a very tricky situation where women are victims, they're exploited, but they're also making decisions, and they're also thinking about how to improve their lives. And that's part of the reason they migrate. But I would argue that one of the things that I've been thinking about is the choices that women make to migrate have to do with the fact that they are taking care of themselves. So oftentimes women will migrate. It's not simply, I'm going to go to the spa today, but I'm migrating for my children because I can't provide for my children at home. And so I am going to leave. I will take this risk. I will take my child with me. And that in itself, I argue, is a form of self-care. They're saying, I need to figure out how to take care of my child. And so if I can start to make more decisions, that is a way to take care of myself. It allows me to make more decisions, to have more freedom, to mother, to be all of these different roles that on one level society expects of me, but on one level I want to do. And where I'm living now, I can't do that. I can't feed my child. If I can't feed my child, how can I take care of myself? And so I'm thinking about self-care. It's something that I'm still working on, but thinking about self-care, not simply, again, how we in the West kind of think about self-care, right? Like, oh, I'm going to have a self-care day or a wellness day. But rather as if I can't do what I need to do to take care of my child, that's also going to affect me. And I need to also figure out a way to do what I want to do so that I can do right by my child. So I can be the mother that I want to be, which is a form of self-care, I would say.
Okay, so we continue with care because this is something that we should bring to the conversation. Care has been the historical terrain of dispute for feminism. And now we think that we want to ask you this question that has to do with the importance that nowadays the new green wave or the new feminist Latin American wave is doing in the political arena. Thousands of women are fighting for the right to take care of their bodies and get an abortion and the right to be alive. And this is the chant that most of us we know. Vivas nos queremos, we want us alive, and ni una más, not one more, in relationship to feminicides and women that are being killed across the globe, but in Latin America the most. So we are curious, Solange, to know how has the feminist struggle shaped your work, and how do you think the new generation of feminists in Latin America, but across the globe, can impact the political conception of care, the right of care, and of course the care of our bodies, and in this case, the right to abortion?
I think that the green wave, if you will, is amazing, and I think that it's motivated and inspired people around the world. For me, it's also extremely important because I think for many of us in the United States, where abortion was first legal, the United States was able to inspire lots of different places. And that's now going to shift because, as probably most of you know, abortion has now been made illegal in the United States. States still have some rights to provide some care, but it's become extremely limited. While at the same time in places like Colombia, Ecuador, Argentina, Chile even, not all these places have made abortion legal, but you have strong feminist movements that are in the streets that are talking about these issues. And I think it's very important. And I remember I taught on Ni Una Menos recently in one of my classes. And we used Verónica Gago, who is the leader of the movement one of the leaders of the movement in Argentina. And she talks about how this is an international movement. Mm-hmm. And I remember teaching my students, again, I live in the United States, in the US, because we have been taught that, it's the greatest country in the world. We tend to not look outside of our borders. And for me, it was very important to really highlight how she is saying this is an international movement. At a time where I think international movements have really lost or they're coming back. But, the United Nations at some point really was this kind of, it allowed for these international movements. And then they became more local. And I think now to bring them back more internationally. And so I think it's very important. And also the public, that public space is also extremely important for so many women who, I think you have lots of young women who feel very empowered, especially educated women. But you also have a lot, I think it's also class-based. You still have a lot of poor women who they're not going to participate in these movements, but they're seeing them in the street. And it's allowing them to think about things. I don't know if I should even share this story, but I remember when I was doing my field research in Argentina for my dissertation, and I was working with Peruvian women, and I at the time I was married to a Peruvian man, and it happened twice that I said, yes, I'm married to a Peruvian man. And the women said, does he hit you? And it was a very practical, very straightforward question. And I was very surprised. But I think that this is extremely important for Latin America, for countries around the world, because it's allowing women to see that they have the right. It becomes then a right. That shout for we have the right to live, we have the right to be, and we have the right to care for ourselves. And you feel it. You feel it in the energy of these movements. So hopefully it will come to the United States, because we need some of that now.
Hopefully.
Yeah, and maybe I can add there, I remember the day the Supreme Court decision was made to illegalize abortion in the US. We exchanged emails, and actually we even exchanged short messages because of the urgency of the topic. And at the same day, in Germany, there was a decision made that now allows, a court decision was made that now allows doctors, medical doctors, to advertise that they are doing abortions. Until now, of course, abortion is legal to a certain degree, but doctors weren't allowed to advertise that on their webpage or whatever. Now they are. So, and I find this so interesting now as you use these global comparisons as well, and then we have this coincidence of diverging court decisions on the world, and therefore, as you mentioned, we need a global movement. But then, of course, the local aspects are different as well. But do you think we can learn from each other? And you said that as the last sentence in your comment. What can we learn from the different contexts? Also looking at maybe Europe and Germany in contrast to the US, and then the Latin American aspect.
I think it's hearing about what's happening locally, but also it's understanding that we are connected. Mm-hmm. And again, I think about this a lot, coming from the United States, teaching in the United States, where so much of what we hear about is just US based. And my students, for example, really don't know too much of what's going on in the rest of the world unless they focused on that or they're children of immigrants. I think that is the most important thing, that what happens in Ecuador is also of concern in Spain. And we don't have enough of that. And these movements, and I think that's why it's actually happening in Latin America, they start in the Global South, because the Global South, they already know that they're connected to the rest of the world. It's Europe, the United States, and countries that are part of this global North that kind of see themselves as special. And we know the history, the colonial history, we know why. But I think that that's why it's also so important that it's starting in South America.
And maybe a kind of a last question could be, I learned, somehow I feel some of us being geographers, and you especially being a cultural geographer, this is really how also geography matters in a way. Because there are comparisons are necessary, global networks are necessary, learning processes are necessary. Why is this a topic? Your research again, why is it a cultural geographical topic?
But how is this geography? And I mean, again, migration is mobility. I think it's easy to say that migration is about moving through spaces, moving through societies, but it's also international. Again, it ties us to these common experiences that so many people have across the world, and tell particular stories that are distinct in some ways, but then also shared. It's interesting. There's the book. I'm kind of changing the subject, but a little bit. There's a book called The English Patient, and there's a line in it that I always think about, which is, "All I ever wanted was a world without maps." And I think the point is to say, it's beyond borders. Borders are what limit us. And, a world without maps would mean that we all felt connected, I think.
Wow, that's a great way to finish this second edition of our podcast series. Ha sido un gusto compartir contigo, Solange, este momento. No sé si tienes algunas palabras de cierre para la audiencia.
Bueno, muchas gracias. Thank you very much. Dankeschön.
Thank you, Solange. We have learned so much from your thoughtful and profound reflections, and thank you for being with us here in Heidelberg. Thank you, dear Ulrike, and thank you, dear Héctor. For our audience, the movement is not ni una más, it's ni una menos. You can Google, navigate, and learn about it more. Thank you, the audience and the subscribers and followers of our podcast. Thank you for listening to this series, Migration and the Americas. Until next time.